Today is March 14th, otherwise known as Pi Day, and I just so happen to be making this video about a file extension that has 3 letters and 4 major downsides. This file format is one that many Dragon Ball modders, especially the old games, have had to deal with or will deal with in the future. And that of course is the ADX audio format. And given that it was made around 1996, it's expected for this format to be rather lossy. And lossy it is because when converting any WAV file to ADX, regardless of the sample rate, the result will always be muffled. One method most modders use to get around it is to amplify the audio's volume before converting. However, that doesn't always provide the best results because it can either hide the muffling or make it even more obvious, which causes inconsistencies with other audio files in the game.
I challenge you! I challenge you!
For this example, I used a voice line from Sparking Zero which sounds pretty close to the original, and even though I applied the same frequency or sample rate as the original ADX file, the lower volume combined with the muffling made the voice lines easier to tell apart. Now, to import this ADX file without having to rebuild the AFS that contains it, I had to replace the voice line before it, which is why both the original and the modified quotes play one after the other. And I wouldn't need to do this if the file sizes actually matched or were at least close enough. And this is a very typical problem with WAV to ADX conversion. It's 100% the file sizes. The frequency is the biggest factor ultimately, which is why I always recommend a sample rate of 24,000 Hz. Anything lower or higher is not going to help at all, and I'll discuss that in just a bit. But the main gripe I have with the file sizes is that any file in an AFS has a maximum, not let's say an average or a minimum, of 2 kilobytes of free or reserved space. So more often than not, that space could be less than a kilobyte, and it just so happens that this U file jumped in size from 13.7 to 15 kilobytes, which makes it rather painful for me having to replace another voice line just so that I don't have to rebuild an AFS, which means rebuilding the ISO for it. Now, back to the sample rates. When setting it below 24,000 Hz, the audio quality becomes much worse, but the file size is way easier to work with.
I challenge you!
It's just, from ADX, if we're talking quality, we've gone down to VAG, which is far worse. And higher frequencies don't necessarily amplify the quality because it depends entirely on the source file. Mine was 48,000 Hz, so I could not increase the sample rate of the ADX to anything above that, as it would only exponentially grow the file size. And even though ADX files are not known for having any file size limits in many PS2 games, the AFS file format itself, which was made for ADX files, does have a limit of 2 gigabytes, so watch out for that. And for my last point, although this has nothing to do with the file extension, I believe it has more to do with the other tools that exist to play these ADX files, such as AFS Explorer and ADX Player. The latter is actually made by Cryware themselves, and funnily enough, I was not expecting it to work and also not work. What I mean by this is that depending on the game I get the ADX files from, it will either play them properly, which it has for Tenkaichi in terms of volume, or it will play them at a much lower volume, making me think that the audio did not have its volume amplified beforehand, so when I go back and do it, it actually sounds fine in the player, but it sounds completely wrong in game. It's way too loud. And so, I've had to use, more often than not, AFS Explorer, even though the output is generally very loud. But like, a voice line from Raging Blast and a voice line from Tenkaichi, it will treat them the same way, which is why I've never had the urge to export the modified ADX, convert it to a wave, amplify it again, and then convert it back into an ADX that will now sound even more muffled than ever before.
Can't you talk for real?
If that doesn't convince you modders out there to make backups of your WAV files before converting them, I don't know what will. And before anyone comes crying at me about this outdated file extension, just know that the OGG file format was made 7 years later, is also considered lossy, yet is far superior in terms of file size and quality. In all fairness though, it may be more of a console problem than a file extension problem, because at the end of the day this audio format still needs to be read and interpreted by actual code in both the game and the console. So I guess ADX wasn't necessarily better, but rather more convenient given that PS2, PS3, and even Wii games use it. Now, if you excuse me, with the time I have remaining, I'm going to drink my problems away caused by this terrible audio format. Thanks for watching.